Something strange has just washed up on the quiet shores of Clearwater Beach, and what the locals found will leave you guessing. Stay until the end. The truth is far more shocking than anyone expected. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The morning over Clearwater Beach rose quietly, painted in pale shades of blue and silver as the tide rolled in with a steady calm. The world still slept, except for Jonathan Reed. For 20 years, he had greeted the ocean before sunrise, pulling on his worn boots, taking the same narrow path down to the sand. The smell of salt and seaweed filled the air, mixing with the crisp chill that hinted winter was near. He was a man shaped by the coast, by loss, by the kind of silence only the sea could understand. His father had once walked this same path every morning before a storm took his boat 15 years ago. Since then, Jonathan had carried on the tradition, more out of memory than need. That morning, however, something felt different. The sound of gulls was scattered and uneasy, and as he approached the shoreline, the mist seemed heavier, pressing against his skin like a warning. He adjusted the strap of his fishing bag and scanned the beach ahead, expecting to see nothing but his small boat resting near the dunes. Instead, his eyes caught on something that didn't belong. Half buried in wet sand lay a massive rust-colored sphere. At first glance, it looked like some kind of old buoy, round and metallic, crusted over with barnacles and salt stains. It was at least 4 feet across, mottled with patches of deep orange and black corrosion. Jonathan stopped a few yards away, heart drumming in his chest. He'd seen all kinds of strange things washed ashore, driftwood, lobster traps, even fragments of sunken ships, but never anything like this. The morning wind shifted, carrying the low groan of waves breaking further down the coast. And when he turned his head, he realized there wasn't just one of those spheres. There were dozens. The entire shoreline, as far as he could see, was scattered with them like a field of sleeping giants. Some were half submerged, others rolled lazily in the surf. His pulse quickened. He took a cautious step closer to the nearest one, pressing his boot into the wet sand. The thing was coated in rust, so thick it flaked off when touched by the seafoam. Tiny barnacles clustered over its surface, and faint symbols, letters maybe, were barely visible under the decay. He knelt, brushing away some grime, and his fingers met cold, solid steel. There was a hole on the upper side, and something about its shape unsettled him. He couldn't name it, but instinct screamed danger. He took a step back, eyes darting along the stretch of beach. Every new wave seemed to drag another sphere closer, like the ocean was pushing them onto land on purpose. The fog began to lift, revealing the small harbor where his boat waited. But Jonathan no longer cared about fishing. He reached for his phone, hands trembling slightly. He called the local Coast Guard station and reported the strange objects on the beach. The officer on duty thought it was probably industrial waste from an old shipwreck. Nothing serious, but promised to send a team to check. Jonathan hung up and turned toward the sea again. The sight of those heavy, lifeless shapes covering the sand filled him with a deep unease, the kind that comes from something too big to understand. By the time the sun fully rose, a thin line of orange slicing through the fog, the tide had begun to recede, exposing more of the spheres. Some lay cracked open, their insides dark and hollow, filled with salt water and seaweed. Others looked intact, as if they'd only just been released from the deep. Jonathan stepped farther back, now almost to the dunes. He felt small standing there, alone between the restless ocean and the quiet town, still asleep behind him. The morning that had begun like any other now pulsed with a sense of threat, silent but undeniable. He remembered something his father once told him when teaching him to read the currents. The sea never gives without taking something first. An hour later, the first sirens broke the silence. 2 Coast Guard trucks rumbled down the narrow access road, tires crunching on the sand. Officers stepped out, their boots sinking into the wet ground, and one of them, an older man with sharp eyes and a windburned face, approached Jonathan. "You the one who called it in?" he asked. Jonathan nodded and pointed toward the field of rusted spheres. The officer's confident stride slowed as he took in the sight. His expression hardened. Without another word, he radioed something back to his team. They started setting up a perimeter, shouting to one another to stay back. Jonathan stood quietly off to the side, his breath clouding in the air. The unease that had gripped him earlier deepened into dread. He didn't know what these things were, but he could tell by the way the Coast Guard moved, cautious, tense, that they were dangerous. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was nothing more than old scrap metal. Still, his eyes lingered on the dark shapes glinting in the morning light. There was something almost deliberate in how they were arranged, as if the sea itself had decided to remind the town of something long forgotten. As he walked back up the path toward the docks, Jonathan looked over his shoulder one last time. The beach that had always been a place of peace now looked haunted. The wind carried a faint metallic tang, the smell of rust and salt mingling into something acrid and old. The waves whispered against the shore, slow and deliberate, dragging at the sand like fingers clawing through memory. He didn't know yet that this morning would change Clearwater Beach forever, that beneath those quiet waves, history was waking up. And soon the whole town would learn what the ocean had been keeping buried for nearly 80 years. By the time the sun climbed high above the horizon, Clearwater Beach no longer looked like the quiet haven Jonathan Reed had known all his life. Within hours of his call, the shoreline had turned into a swarm of movement. Police cars, military trucks, and a line of black vans marked with the seal of the Naval Research Division. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the cold wind, enclosing the beach like a wound that needed sealing. Reporters had begun to gather on the road above the dunes, their cameras trained on the scene below. Jonathan stood behind the barrier, watching as strangers in hazmat suits moved carefully among the rusted spheres, measuring, photographing, and whispering in intense voices. From one of the vans stepped a woman in her late 30s, her brown hair tied back beneath a Navy cap embroidered with the insignia of the U.S. Navy. She moved with calm authority, her gaze sharp and analytical. Someone addressed her as Dr. Allison Mason. She was a Marine Ordnance Specialist, a civilian scientist who worked with the Navy to identify and neutralize underwater explosives. Jonathan didn't know what any of that meant in detail. But when she looked out toward the shore, even from a distance, he could tell she was not calm inside. Allison made her way down to the sand, clipboard in hand, and knelt near one of the spheres. The object's surface was uneven, eaten away by rust, and covered with small barnacles. She brushed away a layer of wet sand and motioned for one of the technicians to bring a portable scanner. The device emitted a low hum as it passed over the metal. On the small display screen, a pattern of colors flickered, orange, yellow, then stabilized in a thin line of solid crimson. Allison froze. "Run it again," she said quietly. The technician obeyed. The same reading appeared. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging in the cold. "Everyone back," she said louder now. 15 feet minimum. Nobody touches anything until we confirm. Her voice carried up the beach, and within moments officers began pushing the onlookers further away. The air felt charged, as if the sea breeze had turned electric. Jonathan stepped back instinctively, his heart pounding again. Something was very wrong. He caught snippets of conversation between the technicians. Magnetic trigger, residual charge. It can't be live, right? But the look on Dr. Mason's face said otherwise. Within minutes, she was on the radio with command. "This isn't industrial scrap," she said in a steady but tense tone. "We're getting explosive signatures consistent with anti-ship ordnance, possibly mid-20th century. I want immediate clearance to evacuate the perimeter." She listened for a response, nodding once before turning to her team. "Get the EOD unit mobilized. I want the entire stretch sealed." A cold murmur spread through the crowd. The realization that these mysterious spheres could be weapons sank in like a stone. Police began moving everyone off the beach entirely, escorting locals back to their cars. Jonathan hesitated at the edge of the cordon, torn between fear and fascination. Dr. Mason caught sight of him, recognizing his worn fishing jacket, the man who had found them first. She walked over, removing her gloves. "You're the one who called this in?" she asked. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't know what they were." "You did the right thing," she said, though her tone carried a heaviness that unsettled him. "If you'd gone any closer or tried to move one of them." She didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear enough. As the morning passed into afternoon, the atmosphere grew tighter. The Naval Explosive Ordnance Disposal Team arrived. 6 men in thick protective suits, moving deliberately, every step measured. They set up scanners, cables, and containment gear. Allison remained near the shore, her eyes constantly shifting between instruments and the restless sea. The wind howled louder, pushing waves against the line of mines that now looked even more menacing in the sunlight. Jonathan stood further back, but couldn't bring himself to leave. There was something haunting about watching the beach he'd grown up on turn into a field of potential death. Around noon, one of the EOD officers called out for Dr. Mason. They had cut through a portion of the corroded shell on one of the spheres and inserted a probe. She knelt beside them, watching the readings come in. Her face changed. What she saw on the monitor drained all color from her cheeks. She stood abruptly, shouting into her radio. "This is confirmed. These are active ordnance. We have multiple live sea mines, likely German origin, estimated from World War II manufacture. I repeat, live explosives. Initiate full evacuation protocol now." The tone of her voice left no room for doubt. Sirens wailed almost instantly. Officers began shouting for civilians to clear the area, and trucks started pulling back from the shoreline. Jonathan felt someone grab his shoulder, ushering him away, but his eyes stayed fixed on Dr. Mason. She was giving orders with rapid precision, calling for backup from the regional military base, instructing her team to set up temporary blast barriers, demanding aerial surveillance to ensure none of the devices had drifted further up the coast. As he reached the top of the dunes, Jonathan looked back one last time. From that height, the beach looked surreal, lined with ghostly rusted spheres half buried in sand, surrounded by figures in protective suits. The sound of the sea, usually so soothing, now seemed cruelly indifferent, each wave hissing against the shore like a whispered warning. The cold wind carried the faint echo of Dr. Mason's final command to her team. "No one touches a thing until we know how unstable they are." By evening, the authorities had closed off the entire stretch of Clearwater Beach. Roadblocks were set up on both ends, and the locals were told to stay indoors until further notice. News helicopters circled above, their rotors chopping through the gray sky. In living rooms across town, television anchors spoke in cautious tones about an ongoing investigation involving unidentified metallic objects. But Jonathan knew it was more than that. He could still see the fear in Dr. Mason's eyes, the same pale shock that had crossed her face when she saw those readings. That night, as darkness fell and the sound of sirens faded into the distance, the sea remained restless. Waves crashed against the barricades, dragging at the sand as if trying to reclaim what it had lost. And somewhere beyond the surf, beneath the cold black water, more of those silent spheres might still be waiting, drifting, forgotten, until the ocean decided to bring them home again. The next morning dawned gray and heavy over Clearwater Beach, the kind of sky that promised rain but held itself back as if waiting for permission. The beach was silent except for the low hum of military machinery and the sharp cries of gulls circling above. The area was now under complete naval control. Miles of coastline had been sealed off with steel barriers, and warning signs were staked deep into the sand. Few people in town understood what had happened, but rumors spread quickly. Stories about old bombs, sunken submarines, and lost warships resurfaced with every passing hour. Jonathan Reed stood at the perimeter fence, staring toward the shore, where he could barely make out the figures of soldiers moving along the sand. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those rusted spheres gleaming faintly under the early light, like eyes staring back from another time. Dr. Allison Mason was already on the beach when he arrived. Her team had spent most of the night running chemical analyses and scanning fragments of the corroded shells. When the results came back at dawn, they confirmed her growing suspicion. These weren't random pieces of debris, nor were they remnants from any known Allied design. The composition matched one thing and one thing only. They were German sea mines, specifically the type used by the Nazis during the last years of World War II. The markings on the interior plates were faded, but still legible. Serial codes stamped in Gothic script, numbers beginning with 1944. She rubbed her temple, the gravity of it settling in. 70, maybe 80 years underwater, she whispered to one of her assistants. And they're still live. She moved toward the Titterline where the waves lapped at the lower half of one of the mines. The air smelled of salt and decay. She could almost imagine the moment decades ago when these weapons were loaded onto a German cargo vessel, perhaps under the command of officers who never imagined their legacy would end up here, haunting an American beach. A young soldier approached her, carrying a weathered binder of photographs retrieved from naval archives overnight. She flipped through the pages, each one showing grainy black and white images of similar mines being deployed off the coast of Europe. On the final page was a photo of a ship, SS Morgenstern, a transport vessel that disappeared somewhere in the North Atlantic in 1944. According to historical records, it carried a full load of naval ordnance when it was torpedoed by an Allied submarine. No one ever found the wreck. Until now. Allison stared out to sea. The earthquake that had struck off the coast 2 nights earlier suddenly made terrible sense. The tremor must have disturbed the ocean floor, cracking open the rusted hull of that forgotten vessel. The mines, still intact after all these years, had broken loose and drifted north with the current until they reached clear water. The realization sent a chill through her. The war had ended generations ago, but its ghosts had just come ashore. She gathered her team and explained what they were dealing with. Each of these mines was designed to detonate on magnetic or contact triggers. Some may have been disabled by corrosion, but we can't assume any of them are safe. The interior mechanisms could still respond to even the smallest disturbance. Her voice was calm, but the lines around her mouth betrayed the weight of the situation. The team listened in tense silence. One of the younger technicians asked how something like this could survive so long. Allison gave a tired half-smile. "Salt water preserves more than it destroys," she said. "Sometimes it keeps history alive in the worst possible way." While the military prepared to send additional EOD units from the nearest naval base, Jonathan approached the fence where Allison stood overseeing the operation. She turned as he called out her name, her expression softening slightly when she recognized him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though not unkindly. "This area is dangerous." "I know," Jonathan replied, "but I had to see it again. I can't stop thinking about it." He hesitated, then added quietly, "My father served in the Navy during the war. He was stationed near the North Atlantic. He used to tell me stories about German ships that went down, about mines they dropped that never exploded." Allison looked at him, surprised. "Then you know what these mean?" "I think I do," he said. It's like the sea finally decided to bring the past back. For a moment, they stood side by side, watching the waves roll over the deadly relics of another era. The rhythmic crash of water against metal echoed faintly across the empty beach, a grim reminder of what still lay hidden beneath the surface. Allison's thoughts drifted to the men who had built these weapons, to the sailors who had died with them, and to the generations that now inherited their danger. She wondered how many times history would have to resurface before people finally learned to respect what was left behind. Later that day, as the scientists cataloged each mine's location, Allison made a chilling discovery. Several of the devices were linked by thick, rusted chains still faintly visible under the sand, indicating they had once been tethered together on the ocean floor. Whatever force had released them had done so suddenly, snapping the chains clean through. The tremor must have been stronger than initially reported. She ordered divers to scan the offshore region in case more mines remained submerged. The thought of dozens more drifting freely beneath the waves tightened her chest. That evening, the first official press statement was released to the public. The authorities confirmed that unexploded wartime ordnance had been found along Clearwater Beach and that specialists were working around the clock to neutralize the threat. Citizens were urged to stay away from the coastline. Most of the town obeyed, locking their doors and watching the news in uneasy silence. But Jonathan couldn't stay away. As night fell, he returned once more to the dunes, where the glow of floodlights illuminated the shoreline like a scene from another world. He could see Allison's silhouette near the water, talking into a radio. She looked small against the vastness of the sea. He thought about his father again, about the stories he'd told when Jonathan was a boy. Stories of warships vanishing in storms, of men who never came home. Back then, they had seemed like legends, far removed from the quiet life of a fisherman. But now, standing on that same coast, Jonathan realized those ghosts were real. The war hadn't ended out there. It had only been sleeping. And now, awakened by the trembling earth, it had come to their shore, cold and merciless as the tide itself. The morning broke with a howling wind that swept across Clearwater Beach, flattening the tall grass on the dunes and stirring up a haze of sand that clung to every surface. The storm that had been forming offshore all night was finally closing in, and the waves were hitting the barricades with violent rhythm. The soldiers and technicians worked against the elements, moving carefully between the marked sites where the mines lay half buried. Every step had to be deliberate. One wrong vibration could mean disaster. The EOD team, dressed in heavy protective suits, moved with the slow precision of surgeons. Each mine was cataloged, scanned, and then surrounded by sandbags to absorb potential blasts. Dr. Allison Mason watched the operation unfold from the command tent set up near the dunes, her face pale under the dim glow of the monitors. She had barely slept in 2 days. Every minute mattered, and the worsening weather made the task feel like racing against time. By midday, the storm clouds were almost overhead, turning the sea into a boiling field of gray. The tide was rising faster than expected, swallowing parts of the beach where the mines were still exposed. Allison stood with her radio pressed to her ear, shouting over the wind. "We need to clear Section 5 before the tide takes it," she ordered. "If the waves reach those devices, we lose control of the situation." Her words were met with static and then a voice confirming movement toward the site. She turned and saw 3 technicians fighting the wind as they carried heavy containment crates across the sand. Nearby, Jonathan Reed was helping load supplies into one of the trucks. He wasn't supposed to be there, but no one had the time or authority to send him away. The fishermen from town had volunteered to assist the crews however they could, hauling cables, securing tents, bringing hot coffee when the hours stretched on. Jonathan worked quietly, focused, but his eyes kept drifting toward the line of figures near the water where danger felt closest. The first explosion came from somewhere offshore, a low, muffled thud that made the ground tremble. Everyone froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the crash of waves. Then, one of the divers' radios crackled with panic. One of the submerged mines detonated. Allison's heart lurched. "Any injuries?" she demanded. The answer came after a long pause. "Negative casualties, but the shock wave destabilized the others. They're shifting on the seabed." The tension in the command tent thickened like smoke. If the mines began to move with the current, they could roll inland with the tide and trigger each other in a chain reaction. Allison clenched her jaw and gave the order she had been dreading. "Pull the divers out. Focus all personnel on retrieval of the exposed ordnance. We finish this now." Hours blurred together in a haze of wind, rain, and shouting. The storm hit full force in the afternoon, driving sheets of cold water across the beach. The soldiers worked through it, heads bowed, voices lost in the roar. Each mine that could be safely extracted was hoisted onto reinforced trucks and driven to a secure detonation site miles inland. But the remaining ones, too unstable to move, had to be disarmed on the spot. Allison knelt in the sand beside one of the EOD specialists as he adjusted the wiring around a mine's corroded trigger mechanism. The air was thick with tension, every movement painstakingly slow. She could feel her pulse hammering behind her ribs, the storm raging around them like a living thing. Jonathan watched from behind the safety line, soaked to the bone. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. There was something mesmerizing about the sight of people confronting death so directly, their courage steady against the chaos of nature. One of the soldiers slipped in the mud, and the sharp clatter of his equipment made everyone freeze. For several long seconds, no one breathed. Then the man regained his footing, and the collective exhale swept through the team. Allison shouted for the area to be cleared. "No unnecessary movement. Treat every inch of sand like it's alive." Her voice, raw from shouting, cut through the storm. By evening, the beach looked like a battlefield. Deep trenches cut through the sand where mines had been removed, and the remaining few lay under tarp covers, surrounded by warning lights. The storm began to weaken, but the work continued. The last device on the list sat near the base of the dunes, half buried and rusted almost to dust. It was smaller than the others, but readings indicated it still contained a live charge. Allison volunteered to oversee the disarmament personally. "We've come too far to lose anyone now," she said. She crouched beside the mine, her gloves slick with rainwater, and began the delicate process of disabling the firing mechanism. Every sound around her seemed amplified. The hiss of wind, the crack of thunder far out at sea, the soft click of her tools. Jonathan stood, motionless several yards away, hardly daring to breathe. When the final wire was cut, Allison leaned back slowly, closing her eyes. The technician beside her nodded, relief visible even through his visor. The danger for now was over. A cheer rose from the small crowd of exhausted workers, but it was brief, subdued by the storm's dying echo. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, and for the first time in days, the sea began to calm. Allison stood, soaked and trembling, and looked out over the water. The horizon was just beginning to clear, streaked with fading light. She thought about how close they had come to catastrophe, how thin the line between peace and destruction could be when the past refused to stay buried. Jonathan approached her quietly, holding out a thermos of coffee. She accepted it with a faint smile, her hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. "You saved this town," he said softly. She shook her head. "No," she replied. "The sea decided to give us another chance. That's all." Behind them, the soldiers were securing the final equipment, the trucks rumbling back toward the road. The beach, once littered with death, was slowly being reclaimed by the tide. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the air, a reminder of how fragile everything could be. As the last light faded behind the horizon, the sound of the waves grew gentle again, as if nothing had happened. But everyone who had stood on that shore knew the truth. The ocean had given up its ghosts, and humanity had survived them by the smallest margin imaginable. When dawn returned to Clearwater Beach, the world seemed unnaturally quiet. The wind had died, the sea had flattened into a mirror of pale blue, and the air carried a heavy scent of salt and wet sand. The storm was gone, leaving behind a coastline that looked both familiar and changed, as if it had shed something invisible during the long night. The barricades were still up, but now only a handful of military trucks remained, their engines silent. Where rows of deadly spheres once lay, there were only smooth patches of sand, faint outlines marking the places where they had been lifted away. Jonathan Reed walked alone along the edge of the tide, his boots sinking softly into the wet ground. The sun climbed slowly over the water, casting gold over the waves. For the first time in a week, the sea no longer looked threatening. It looked tired, as though it too wanted to rest. Further down the shore, Dr. Allison Mason stood by the remnants of the command post, her uniform stained with sand and salt. She was writing her final report, but her mind wasn't in the paperwork. She watched the surf roll in and out, thinking of all that had happened. In her career, she had handled countless ordnance recoveries, torpedoes, bombs, even unexploded shells, but none had carried the same weight as this. These mines were more than weapons. They were messages from a time when the world was breaking itself apart. For days, she had stared into the faces of those relics, rusted and barnacled, and had felt as if the ocean itself were speaking. When Jonathan approached, she closed the folder and turned toward him, managing a small smile. "It's over," she said, though her tone carried both relief and sorrow. "The last of them have been detonated inland. The beach is safe again." Jonathan nodded, his gaze wandering to the horizon. "Safe?" he repeated softly, tasting the word like something unfamiliar. Strange how fragile that sounds after what we've seen. He took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. "You think the sea's done with us?" Allison looked back at the waves, their gentle rhythm masking the depth beneath. "The sea is never done with anyone," she said. "It just waits until we forget, then reminds us." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the slow retreat of the tide. By noon, the cleanup crews had begun dismantling what was left of the camp. Soldiers loaded crates into trucks, folding the tents that had once lined the dunes. Reporters tried to approach, but the authorities kept them at a distance. The official story would be simple: old wartime debris recovered. No casualties. Situation contained. But those who had been here knew it was more complicated. They had seen how the past could rise from the sea and threaten the present without warning. Jonathan watched the trucks depart one after another until the last of them disappeared down the narrow road leading back to town. The silence that followed felt immense. As evening approached, the people of Clearwater began to emerge from their homes. Families walked down to the beach cautiously, children running ahead to collect shells. The ocean looked calm and innocent again, reflecting the orange glow of sunset. Jonathan stood near the dunes, waiting until the crowd thinned, then walked down to the spot where he had first found the rusted sphere. The sand there was smooth now, unmarked, as if nothing had ever happened. He carried something in his hands, a small metal plaque, polished and engraved with careful words. Kneeling, he placed it into the sand and pressed it down until it stood upright. The inscription was simple, in memory of those who fought, and those who kept the shore safe when the sea remembered them. Allison joined him a moment later, her coat pulled tight against the cooling air. She read the words and nodded silently. Together they stood watching the horizon as the sun sank lower, the light fading to crimson. The wind whispered softly through the dunes, carrying the faint scent of seaweed and rain. "You know," Jonathan said quietly, "my father used to tell me that the sea keeps everything it touches." Maybe he was right. Allison smiled faintly. "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes it lets go just long enough for us to learn something." As the last light faded, the waves rolled in once more, gentle and endless. The beach, now free of its deadly cargo, seemed to breathe again. The ocean stretched out before them, vast and unknowable, holding within it all the stories of those who had come before. For the first time since that terrible morning, Jonathan felt at peace. He took one last look at the water, then turned to leave, the sound of the surf following him like a heartbeat. Behind him, the plaque gleamed faintly in the dusk, a quiet reminder of what had been endured and what had been saved. The sea had given back its ghosts, and for now, Clearwater Beach belonged to the living once more. The sea never forgets its secrets. It only waits for the right moment to reveal them. What do you think really happened? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, leave a like, and stay tuned for more mysteries.